Hey everybody, my name's Tim. This is my 2020 Shelby GT500 carbon fiber track pack. This video today is about the VMP Apex Predator larger lid that goes on top of your supercharger, as well as the larger intercooler brick that goes underneath this big lid. Allows for more cooling in these cars. You think these cars have badass cooling? They do from the factory, but it's next level with this lid. I'm going to show you what this is, some surprises. We're going to talk to Justin, and then the big portion of this video is going to be the step-by-step 4K multiple camera angles, detailed, in-depth install to make it easier for the next guy that's doing this mod. Hope you enjoy this video. Here we go. Thanks for watching. Justin from VMP is here, and he is the horse's mouth source for all this stuff, the expert. So I'm going to be doing this mod here very shortly. When you're watching this video, I have done this mod. Tell us about this.
So you got one of these at home for your car.
The Apex Predator lid.
And I designed this lid because I wanted to make more horsepower on the GT500s, and I wanted to keep temperatures under control. So like this improves the car twofold. Airflow wise, I've got these special shapes that are cast into the lid. You know, there's kind of a sneak peek here. This helps distribution and utilization of the intercooler core. And then this lid also sits higher, but still fits under the strut tower brace.
That's a good thing.
So we can fit a bigger intercooler core under it. And all this works together to keep your car cooler under extreme abuse of
road course racing.
Yes.
So I was talking with Justin a couple days ago, and he's talking about the throttle blade closing to maintain temperature. Right? So we're going to find out when I get this and I go running down those straights.
You'll find more power and cooler temperatures, which is great for engine longevity and knock resistance. And the computer runs more time when the air temp is cooler. So it's just a good all around situation.
More is always better. Thanks, Mr. Justin. It was a little windy when I was talking to Justin. Couldn't quite hear everything we were talking about. So to sum things up, these cars have great cooling from the factory, great power as well. But what you don't know is that when temperatures start getting a little bit higher, the throttle position starts closing a little bit to keep temperatures in check. All you see on the dash is that temperatures are good. You don't know that you're actually losing power. So if you add the better intercooler with the bigger lid to support the intercooler, now you have increased cooling capacity, allows that throttle position to stay open, unleashing all your power. Out for a drive. I was surprised at the amount of supercharger noise you hear with the different lid. Apparently the OEM lid has a lot of sound deadening in it. This is still the original pulley, so I'm not spinning faster. But as you get the RPMs up, you hear it, obviously, oh here, let me go to quieter exhaust. Hear that howl right there? That is the supercharger screaming. Definitely a different sound, much more pronounced whine. Alright, we're flashing forward to my first track event after doing this mod. This is Circuit Americas in Austin, Texas. Big, long back straight. I've got two buddies there in the same cars. One's a base model, one of my students. His top speed on the back straight was 147 for the day. A buddy of mine who's a former pro racer, drives carbon fiber track pack just like I do. He's nailing corner exits and he hit 153. My car got up to 159, and it's worth mentioning it was 100 degrees that day. Time to take a look at the VMP website, www.vmpperformance.com. Go to cooling. Down there you'll find intercooler upgrades. This is the street version. These are the details of the street version. VMP recommends going to the race version when you have more than 900 horsepower. That's wheel. Looking at the lid, this is the lid that's going to be required for either one of these intercooler upgrades, the taller Apex Predator lid. Into my garage we go. The OEM lid on the left, the Apex Predator lid on the right. You can see it's taller there. Not only is the Apex Predator lid taller, but also has an improved design on the bottom side there for better flow. Just showing the seal there moved over from the OEM lid over to the Predator lid. That'll be all covered in the install portion later in this video. On to the intercooler. So you see the original one there with the paper towel stuck in it. This is a good side-by-side showing the much larger VMP unit on the left. Measuring the height of the OEM intercooler, you can see there it's a little bit under 3 inches. Moving over to the much larger VMP unit, and there you can see it's about almost 3.5 inches. Took this picture during the install process, which will be covered here shortly, and that is the end results. Now that we know what it is and what it can do for you, it's time to take a deep dive on the install. Shot this with multiple cameras, 4K, and narrate it and make it easier for the next guy. Here we go. Started by laying out what I need for this project on a table. This project won't take you too long. Follow my video, it'll address a lot of stuff that you may have questions on. Got the new intercooler on the left, the associated hardware bags, the new lid on the right. Socket sit on the floor, and I use a vacuum airlift system. If you have one, that's great. I put some protection around the front of my car because you're going to be rubbing up against it while you're doing this install. I used a broom handle to hold up the hood. Next step up is to clean all the debris out of the engine bay. Just use an air compressor, clean it out. You need to remove your hood strut. That's why I've got the broom handle. The clips just pull out and the hood strut pops off both ends. Removing the battery cable is always a good idea when working on cars like this. I always remove the negative battery cable, which I did first. Later realized I really need to remove the positive cable because it's on top of the strut tower brace, which needs to come off. So skip the negative battery cable and just remove the positive. Next item is using a trim tool like this, removing the strut tower brace. Those 2 holes that I pointed to at the right side there normally have push pins. I had those removed because I have a master cylinder cover. Get all the push pins out from both the driver and passenger side. Then you can lift up that 2-piece cowl like I'm doing there, and you'll see the 13mm bolts. There's 3 underneath that cover there, and there's 2 off on the passenger side that need to come out. You're going to need something to hold that piece of plastic up there. It's a 13mm. I use a box head ratcheting wrench. You can jam a 2x4 or a piece of wood in there. I chose to use rags, just a little less abrasive. But it's a tight space, hard to get your hands in there. Make sure you hang on to the hardware as it's coming out. Don't drop it down into the engine bay. But it's very doable. I used 1 rag, kind of moved it around, then you can switch to 2 rags if needed. After you get all 3 of the 13mm bolts hidden underneath the cowl there out by hand, you can switch to an impact gun and get the remaining 2. There's a total of 5 13mm bolts. Switch to a 15mm deep socket and remove the 4 nuts that are holding down the strut tower, 2 on the passenger and 2 on the driver's side. I'm going a little out of order from the VMP instructions just to make the job easier for the next guy here, but it would be helpful to drain your intercooler reservoir now. I've got this big syringe looking thing. However you want to drain it, just get it empty now. Remove the 8mm bolts that are holding the degas bottle on the strut tower brace. Also loosen but do not remove that silver bolt there to make reinstallation easier. Move the degas bottle out of the way and then work up the strut tower brace on both sides and then lift it out. Next up is to remove this bypass hose from the water jacket. This hose goes to the degas bottle. Slide the hose clamp aft away from it. The hose is a little baked on, hard to get off, can't just pull it off. I used a pick to get underneath it and get it off. It will leak a little fluid, so be ready for it. Make sure your lid is on the reservoir when you're messing with the system because fluid can come into the degas bottle there pretty quickly. And then when you take the lid off, be ready to suction out fluid because it can come in rather quickly. Time to drain the intercooler so it doesn't leak into your intake when you're taking it off. You need to either use a hose clamp on that hose or hold it by hand. Very low air pressure, just little taps of air because it'll spray out through the reservoir. Once the degas bottle has some coolant buildup in it, stop, suck out the fluid, and then rinse repeat with more air pressure. And can't emphasize enough, very low pressure, just little bursts. Keep going until there's no more fluid coming out of your intercooler. I have an 8mm on a universal socket to remove the 2 bolts on the front of the water manifold. Slide the water manifold out. Be careful of your green seal there. You can also remove these 2 tubes here, get them out of the way now. Using a trim tool again, you need to remove 3 push pins on the passenger side plastic black tray. The one by the oil separator does not need to come out, but there are 2 others that are on the side, and then there's a gray one that's on the aft part there that needs to be pushed towards the back of the car to come out. 10mm socket on an impact, removing the 3 nuts on both the passenger and driver's side to get the plastic trays removed. Each side has one on the back that are a little more challenging to get to. I had to use a universal on the driver's side. Be careful you don't drop those nuts down into the engine bay. Getting the hose trays out can be a little challenging. The pry tool helps get the holes lifted up over the studs. The studs tend to grab with the threads. And then you got to move the hoses around until the trays come out. Next up, just grab the foam, the sound insulator, and pull that out. Same for the driver's side, wiggle it around to create some space with the hoses. You may need to pry up on the tray to get it off the threads. There is a push pin that needs to come out. It's obvious because it's blocking access to the tray. The purge solenoid is on the driver's side fuel rail. You need to remove that green clip there, pull that out. Also that white locking tab, slide it towards the trunk and then press it in. There's one more green connector up front, get that off as well. And then you'll be able to move the tray with the solenoid attached to it. This will be the most challenging aspect of the mod so far, but it's still very doable. There's a 10mm nut there that needs to come out. I used a universal in my impact. Back that nut off, don't drop it down into the engine bay. This exposes a tab on a wiring harness that goes down to the transmission, and you cannot lift that tab up and off of that stud. You have to chop it, and this is a flash forward look to later after I chopped it. It's a trade-off between making a very large opening so that it's easy on and off, but then it won't be very well secured later when you attach this with the 10mm nut. So you can do 1 slit and pry it back. I recommend 2 slits, just a little bit wider opening like you see there, and then you pry it aft. The VMP video shows them lifting it up and over to get it back on the stud. You're not going to be able to do that because there's no slack there. So you're going to basically have to force it back on through that opening back onto the stud. Next up is the map sensor. There's a white locking tab, pull that out, press it in to release the electrical connector. And then there's a push pin. You need to use a pry tool to get up. My trim push pin actually snapped off. On to the 8mm bolt holding everything down. There are 4 with the fuel rails. Use a long or a deep socket because you're going to need those for the studs next. Once you get the 4 bolts off the fuel rail, set those aside and move on to the 6 studs that hold the trays in place. Of those 6 studs, there are 3 on the driver's side, 3 on the passenger side. Those hold the trays in place. The one on the back side of the driver's side will require a universal to get underneath the cowl. There's one more stud in the back. That's the transmission harness that you had to do the chop into to get it off of the stud. There's 2 more regular bolts up front that I'm removing right there, and then there's one last hidden bolt in the very back. Pay attention to where you're removing bolts versus studs because you're going to have to reinstall the studs and the bolts in the correct location, and this graphic here will show you the locations. Time to get the fuel rails up and out of the way so you can get the lid off. You may need a trim pry tool lifting up gently on the bottom of each injector. I didn't need to do that. I just gently pulled up. Be careful because your fuel system may still be pressurized. Next, I use a garden hose hooked to a vacuum to get into tight spaces to get the debris out from around the injectors. I used a trim tool to pry up on the edges of the lid. The fuel rails are a little bit in the way there, just pull them off to the side. I also put some painter's tape on the back of my OEM lid to keep it from getting all scratched up when sliding it out. But just work at it, it comes out. You may have to go around each side and do a little lifting, but it comes right out. More cleaning, I've got that hose attachment on the end of my vacuum hose. Just getting debris out from around the intake tubes there. And then I came out with simple green and a rag just to get the oils. There's a bit of oil deposit around there, just getting a good clean surface, because my next step is I sealed off the intake tubes with painter's tape to keep anything from going down in there. There are 10 8mm bolts, 5 down each side. The last one on the driver's side will need a universal to get underneath the cowl. Set the bolts aside, take that hold down plate out. Repeat on the passenger side, get all 5 out plus a hold down plate. And then once all that's out, you can lift the intercooler out. Be careful you don't dump it, tip it. There may be some residual coolant in there. In with the new cooler, be careful you don't pinch your tape. Make sure the tape isn't between the intercooler and your intake. And then replace the hardware that you just took out. You reuse the bolts that came out holding the intercooler down. There's probably going to be some oil on the threads. Clean those up real well. I chose to use Loctite. Thread them all in by hand. Be careful not to drop them down in the engine bay or down in your intake. Make sure your tape secures the holes there, but also make sure you don't pinch the tape when you're securing the new intercooler down. Once you got them all secure in there just by hand, I used my impact on a very light setting, and I will come back after and torque them all to spec. The torque spec for these is listed as 124 inch-pounds. I chose to go a little less because Loctite is kind of a lubricant. Ease up on your torque, approach it slowly. Don't just go for the gusto from the get-go, because if you strip out these holes, that would be a bad thing. When torquing down the bolts, start with the middle one and work your way out both ways, and then you'll need a universal to get access to the rear bolt underneath the cowl. I found the fuel rails to be in the way when trying to get the lid back on, so I held those back, as you can see, with electrical tape. It's time to remove the painter's tape on your intake runners, and it's time to prep the lid. This is your map sensor. Lube it up. There's an O-ring right there, so you can press it into the port. This is pressing your old map sensor into the new lid. Give it some wiggle, don't just roll the O-ring over. And then in the bag of hardware is one short screw. It is a 5mm hex key or Allen key bolt. I put a little Loctite on it. Thread that in, and there's no torque specs on this. You're just going into plastic, so I made it snug. Also worth mentioning, you can see the other ports there for meth injection. There's also a boost port. Those are, aux items or optional items. The instruction sheet as well as the VMP video shows you plug in all those. Mine arrived all plugged. Regarding the green seal on the supercharger lid, they are considered one-time use seals, but my car is fairly new. The seal's in great shape. I reuse mine. VMP says they reuse them often. If your car is old, you may want to get a new seal, but this seal as well as the green seal on the water jacket are both considered one-time use. I reused them both, 0 issues. Transfer it over to the new lid, make sure it's fully seated and oriented properly, and it should be good to go. Time to get the new lid in place. I protected mine with some painter's tape. You kind of rub it against the cowl there on the back side of the supercharger lid, trying to get into position. Painter's tape will keep it from getting scratched up. Also the fuel rails there, as I got them held back with tape. They're still in the way a little bit, still rub a little bit on the sides of the supercharger lid, so protective tape is good. And then once they're in place, remove that hold back tape if you did that on your fuel rails. I used a toothbrush to clean around the bases of the injectors. It's a tight area to get your hands down in there, so using a toothbrush worked pretty well. And then rolled the O-rings around, make sure all sides of the O-rings are good and clean. Use my garden hose on a vacuum one more time to get that area around the injectors good and clean. The injector O-rings need lube to get them to slide back into their ports without rolling over. I used that same toothbrush I used to clean them. I put lube on the toothbrush and then got it down around the O-rings. I rolled the O-rings around to make sure I got all sides of the rings lubed, and then you simply press down the entire fuel rail, make sure the injector is fully seat. Rinse, repeat on the driver's side, just getting them good and lubed and then pressing down the rails. Time to lock everything down with the hardware. I started out with the 4 fuel rail bolts. The instructions say that you may want to put all the bolts in first before snugging it down. I just put in the 4 fuel rail bolts first. The torque specs listed in the instructions are for dry. I used Loctite, so I went a little bit less. If you do that, how much less is up to you. I snugged them down with an 8mm socket on an impact. Then I came back and I torqued them down. The instructions for the fuel rail bolts say 89 inch-pounds plus 90 degrees more. I did a little bit less. This shows the fuel rail bolts in, the other hardware is not in yet. If you're going to reuse the black plastic trays, you reuse your studs. If you're not using those, regular hardware that comes with the lid works. This shows where studs versus regular bolts go. Again, I used Loctite, so I backed off my torque settings a little bit, and this is putting in the studs. There's 3 down the driver's side, 3 down the passenger side, and there's also the one on the back of the driver's side, where you had to split the harness going down to the transmission. You see the passenger side here with just the 2 fuel rail bolts on that side showing none of the other hardware is there. I'm inserting the studs into the passenger side. Like I said, there's 3 down the passenger side plus the one in the back. And then once you get all those in, this is what it looks like here. The stud location in the back can be a little confusing. Move the wire harness out of the way and you'll see it. There's another hole back there that doesn't go all the way through that looks like it's for the stud. It is not. It's got to go all the way in for threads. Then 8mm, I snugged everything down very lightly with the impact gun and came back and torqued it all down with the torque wrench. The hardware on the back side of the supercharger is a little challenging to get to. Don't forget there's 1 stud back there and there's 1 regular bolt back there. Kind of in the back middle of the supercharger, if you will. The VMP instructions say to start with the studs, tightening those down, then do the regular bolts, and then do the fuel rails last. The torque specs, which I mentioned earlier, studded bolts are 106, the regular non-studded bolts are 115, and the fuel rails are 89 inch-pounds plus 90 degrees of turn. And you can actually use those marks on the supercharger lid for 90 degrees of turn. Once you get everything on and tightened down, and it does say it's good to go from the middle out for what it's worth, so start from the center, go out. Once you get everything on and tightened down, go back and recheck everything, torque specs, just to make sure it's good, you didn't miss anything. There's the little bolts up front too. Look at the diagram, the blue versus red, and make sure you get it all. Reconnect the map sensor on the passenger side, back side of the supercharger, and push the little white locking tab down. Time to reinstall the water jacket. Take these guys, lube up O-ring on one side, insert it into the lid. Make sure you get the lube all the way around. I just use some generic Teflon lube. Use whatever you have around that works for you. And then once they're inserted, I lube the other side, ran my finger around to get the lubricant all the way around. The green seal there on the water jacket, as well as the green seal underneath the supercharger lid, are both considered one-time use seals. My car is fairly new and the seals are in good condition, so I reused them. VMP reuses them often too. If the car is older, you may want to put some new ones on there. And then those bolts, when you go to tighten them down, I snugged them both up individually, and then I went back with the torque wrench. 106 inch-pounds is the official number. I went a little bit less because I used thread locker on mine. If you're not reusing the black plastic hose trays, no need to reuse the studs. VMP includes this hardware to replace the studs. Next up, reattach the degas bottle hose. The hose clamp can fight you a little bit, just work it over. I used a needle nose pliers. There's also a hose kind of clip or clamp to keep the 2 hoses spaced and hooked together. Don't forget to reattach that. These next couple of steps depends on if you're going to reuse the black plastic hose trays, which I did. I put the sound deadener back in on top of the fuel injectors. If you choose not to use those hose trays, you can just kind of tidy up your hoses. You can zip tie them, do whatever you want, but pay attention to the orientation. I showed the driver's side previously there a bit ago, and this is the passenger side. You kind of have to move the hoses around to get them to sit down on top of the injectors just right. If you're going to reuse the black plastic hose trays, you're going to have to grind down these things that I'm pointing at right here, these tabs. They're more of a square edge, and the receiver spaces on the new lid are kind of rounded, so you got to kind of make some more clearance there. I took a couple trips to the benchtop grinder to make some more space. You can see there grinding off the edge just to make it seat fully down on the stud, which ended up working. You also need to grind that black plastic tab off below the map sensor plug. Right there shows that I grinded that down, made much more room, and then use the grinder to remove all the sharper edges on these tabs here. Again, this only applies if you're reusing the black plastic hose trays, but they fight you a little bit, especially the threads on the studs there. You got to move the hoses around to get them oriented properly to fit down on top of the trays. This is the driver's side. That shows it up close when it's all in position properly. Over to the passenger side, a little bit more of a challenge because now you're dealing with the potentially with the oil separator. Move the stuff around, get the hose trays on top of the foam, underneath the hoses. I disconnected the map sensor again. It's got that little white locking push tab. Disconnected that, got it out of the way. Reconnected, don't forget to push the white locking tab back down. And then when you get everything situated on the passenger side, you'll find 2 push pins that need to get pushed back into the hose tray. There are some connections on the driver's side that you need to reconnect. This hose here, make sure you push it all the way down until it clicks. Reseat the green connector, give it a tug. The purge solenoid, reconnect that, give it a tug again, make sure it's on there firmly, as well as the electrical connector. Push the clip down to lock it, and then finally there's a push pin on the driver's side that I just connected there. And this shows everything back into place properly. This also only applies if you're reusing the black plastic hose trays. But if you are, resecure the trays with the nuts back onto the studs there, and you're just tightening these down onto plastic. You know, don't go crazy on them. I just tightened them all by hand loosely and then came back and snugged them with a ratchet wrench. This is the transmission harness stud in the back of the Supercharger. The VMP video just shows them lifting it up and over. That's not possible because there's no slack, so you need to slide the slit back through over the bolt. The wider the slit, the easier it is to get on the bolt. I had to pull really hard towards the front of the car to get it on there. And then the flange of that nut rubs on the Supercharger case. I didn't crank it down too hard because of that. I just got it snug. Next up is the bolt on the back side there that's marked in red. It's kind of to the right center, if you will. I use this flexible holder to hold it to get the bolt down into the slot so I didn't drop it down into the engine bay, and then fed it in by my hand. Next up, I used a universal to snug it down and then tighten it to 106 inch-pounds like the rest of them. This shows both of them that we just did, the tight access connectors. You got the transmission harness stud up front with the nut that I just snugged down, as well as the bolt in the back that was marked with red. Onto the 2 bolts up front marked in red right there. Insert them by hand, snug them down, tighten them to 106 inch-pounds. There is a push pin on the back side of the passenger hose tray. Push that forward towards the front of the car. There's a total of 3 push pins on the passenger side. Next up is reinstalling the strut tower brace. You got to lift up the plastic cowl trim there to get it underneath there. Just got to kind of move things around. It's going to have a little bit of a challenge sitting down onto the studs. I had to go back side to side. A second set of hands would work great. If you're working by yourself, just move side to side, wiggle it around, and it'll eventually seat down onto the studs. The VMP video does say make sure you're on level ground, not on a rack or uneven, so that the strut tower brace goes on even and flat. Once it's in position, secure the 4 15mm nuts. Don't tighten them down. Get all hardware in position before you tighten anything down. There are 2 8mm bolts that go on the DGOS bottle. There's also an 8mm bolt on the driver's side strut tower. There are 5 13mm bolts that go across the back side of the strut tower brace. 3 of those are hidden underneath the cowl, As you can see, I used some rags, moved them around. You can use blocks of wood, but you need to get up underneath there, get all the hardware into position. I used a ratcheting box wrench to tighten down those bolts underneath the cowls. You can see there, it's kind of hard to get to. I didn't use any torque setting, I just went tight. And then when you come back, there's these 15mm bolts, tighten those down. And then 8mm bolts, there's 3 of them on the driver's side, 2 for the degas bottle, and one last one up on the top of by the strut tower there on the driver's side. Time to reinstall the hood strut. The bigger portion of the strut goes down. Push the receivers onto the nubs there, pull the little clips out if you need to, and then give them a yank to make sure they're fully secure so your hood doesn't slam shut. Time to refill the coolant. I'm using a vacuum lift system for the first time. I've had it for a while, never used it, but worked pretty well. You're either going to pour the coolant in by hand or use a vacuum system like this to suck it in. If you're going to use a vacuum system, you're going to need to seal off the overflow hole at the bottom of the degas bottle, and I sealed mine off with duct tape. You'll see here in a bit. Also had to use basically one of the washer seals that make the tight seal on the opening. But yeah, fill the system with however you fill it, and then run it to make sure it's circulating. The vacuum tool does a good job getting all the air out of the system. My left hand there is the adapter I had to use to seal up the neck. There's a good close look at it. After it's all filled, run it, make sure the system is circulating coolant. In the upper left corner there you can see the hole for the overflow port, which I sealed with duct tape. I'm taking that duct tape off now. Don't forget to remove that if you do it. Top off your system degas bottle when you're all done, and there's marks on the side for min and max. Well, that's it. That is the VMP Apex Predator lid and larger street intercooler. The same process for the race intercooler. Hope you enjoyed this video. A lot went into it. Thanks for watching. See you next time.